So, we begin. My name is Donall McGinley. I'm the academic tutor for the Introduction to Philosophy course, and this is the launch day lecture. So, of course, we're all in states of isolation around the country. I am here in Donall, which you can see on the set of an intergalactic space tractor, because my usual philosophy bunker is being rebuilt. I'll say something first about my background. I'm a scholar primarily of later medieval philosophy, of philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas, Henry of Ghent, John Duns Scotus, the great Scottish Franciscan philosopher, and William of Ockham, the English Franciscan philosopher. And as well as that, I've an interest in analytic metaphysics, analytic philosophy in general. It's the analytic philosophy of the 20th century, the school of Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore. And what I'm going to be doing for this lecture course is I'm going to be, of course, giving you the lectures, the study days and the tutorial days, as well as this launch day. And on top of that, I'll be available for consultation by email. You can send me any email questions you like. Either you can email me personally, or we can ask questions on the forum, the student forum. And the student forum likewise has got a sort of a function is that you can discuss things with each other and sort of swap ideas and questions and queries. And I'll tune into the forum, I try not to take over discussions or anything too much, but I will provide you with some notes or answer any questions that you have related to the contents of the course. So, this course itself is an introduction to philosophy, and its focus is, as we'll see, is primarily historical. And we can see that the study of the history of philosophy has been important to the study of philosophy per se for a long time, really since its inception, certainly since Aristotle. Looking at the views of previous philosophers has been important. But on top of that, it's going to be just a general description of philosophy as an enterprise. And as well as why philosophy might be of use to theologians as kind of a constant underlying theme, particularly when we're discussing philosophers in the Middle Ages. And we'll discuss it today as well a little bit. But the first thing to notice is this is not a course in theology, despite the fact your degree, if you're pursuing it, is in theology. This course is an academic course that is in pure philosophy, though I will give some examples from the philosophers of the Middle Ages who were mostly also professional theologians. And when we look at the kind of general underlying notion of why philosophy is of use to theology, we'll be thinking about why it might be of use to a theology degree as well. And of course there's a whole kind of historical school of the relationship between philosophy and theology, which will come up. But again, the course itself is one that's purely philosophical, and as such, though it might be of use to theology, it isn't a branch of theology or anything like that. So when we start looking at philosophy, of course, we have a vague notion of philosophers in public life. There are very few now, but we know people like Bertrand Russell or Jean-Paul Sartre with the sitting in a cafe with with a pipe, writing philosophy and sort of thinking great thoughts. But many of us, to begin with, might not be familiar with what philosophy is as a discipline, other than these very kind of vague pictures of it. So the question, what is philosophy, itself is interestingly, it is a philosophical question. And you'll find this a lot in philosophy, of this kind of reflective thinking about the nature of its own discipline. What is mathematics, incidentally, is not a mathematical question, of course. That too is a philosophical question. So these are philosophy deals with the very general in the world, and it's difficult to kind of apprehend what philosophy is independently of doing it. So the best way of figuring out what philosophy is doing some philosophy and saying that is what philosophers do, this is what the discipline of philosophy is. And again, the generality of philosophical inquiry is really what sets it apart from other academic disciplines. Physics, modern physics studies all kinds of aspects of matter and change and time and the relationship between time and space and the like. But in philosophy, the questions are even more general. There's questions such as what is time, what is change, and then you end up asking, when you ask these questions, you get into questions of metaphysics, such as what is it for something to persist through time? What is it for something to change but remain the same type of thing or the same thing? And these are questions not of physics or of chemistry. These are purely philosophical questions. At the very beginning, I might first of all do, given that the full course itself at the Priory Priory Institute is one of theology, it might be useful to do what we call in philosophy demarcation. So demarcation simply means that we try to define the disciplines, distinguish them from each other, so as not to confuse the two disciplines. So how is philosophy demarcated? How is it distinguished from theology? The major thing is in its starting point. You'll find a lot of crossover sometimes in the questions that are asked in philosophy and theology. But in philosophy, the starting point is one of pure reason. We start with what we know, or what we take ourselves to know, of the world around us, the information that's given to us by our senses, and indeed by the sciences. And of course then, these things themselves can be questioned. It's not that we just accept them, they can be questioned. But that's the starting point. The starting point is ordinary reason, ordinary sensation, and indeed our ordinary beliefs. Aristotle called these sort of standard beliefs that we have in society, he called them the orthodoxa, which gave rise to the term orthodoxy. Orthodoxa simply means common belief. So this is incredibly common beliefs, such as there are chairs in this room, people persist over time, the sun is very old. Then scientific beliefs such as the sun rotates around, or rather the earth rotates around the sun, and these kinds of things. We start with the very basic, and of course we'll see that in the quotations on the handout I've given you, that these very standard kind of common beliefs will themselves give rise to philosophical problems or sort of puzzles of things that don't make sense, and that's really the springboard for the philosophical enterprise, the starting point for it. So that's the description of philosophy. What demarcates it from theology is theology's starting point isn't one of pure reason. In theology, there's a starting point of either scripture as a starting point, or some kind of authority as the starting point, which is an accepted authority, and this is then taken as axioms of some sort. Axioms that can then be used for further inquiry and further analysis. faith is very often seen as being the sort of starting point of theology, but faith is really the manner of belief. It's the manner in which the authority is believed on faith. So really it's some sort of authority, scriptural or otherwise, that is the starting point for theology. So, but whether there are some people, now I'll mention this again, there are some scholars who deny that some of the philosophers we'll be studying, such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and the rest, deny that really what they were doing is philosophy. It's very hard to defend this view, but it is one that people have recently tried to defend. But I'll be taking it that the starting point in doing philosophy, the starting point that the 20th century analytic philosophers had in their philosophical thinking, is the same as Plato's starting point, Aristotle's, Augustine's and Thomas Aquinas' starting point, and that is pure reason and the information given to us by the senses, and these kind of common beliefs. So they're doing the same discipline. So they've the same discipline because they have the same starting point and the same method, simply by pure reason. So look at the first quotation. This is from the London, from the book that was used for the London course, and incidentally it's where I did my undergraduate degree in King's in London. So this is from Anthony Grayling. The aim of philosophical inquiry is to gain insight into questions about knowledge, truth, reason, reality, meaning, mind and value. Other human endeavours, not least art and literature, explore aspects of these same questions, but it is philosophy that mounts a direct assault on them, in the hope of clarifying them and, where possible, answering them. Philosophy, the word, is derived from the Greek word literally meaning love of wisdom, but it is better and more accurately defined as inquiry and reflection, allowing these expressions their widest scope to denote thought about general features of the world and human experience within it. The Greeks speculated about the origins, composition and functioning of the physical universe. They discussed the ethical and political circumstances of mankind and proposed views about their best arrangement. They investigated human reason itself and the nature of truth and knowledge. In doing so, they touched upon almost every major philosophical question, and their legacy to subsequent thought is vast. So, we can see the kind of important features there of what I've mentioned before, is that it's the general features of the world that philosophy is inquiring into. These kind of fundamental structures that the world has. Metaphysics, particularly, we'll see in this course, the fourth unit is called Metaphysics, but in fact all the way through we'll really be discussing the metaphysical theories of the philosophers we're encountering. And indeed, metaphysics is somehow a foundational discipline within philosophy. It's asking about the nature of reality itself. It's, again, very abstract, but when we get into it, we'll see that we can sort of get a handle on what the discipline is doing when we start to ask some of these questions. So metaphysics is a fundamental inquiry. It's really the most general inquiry about the structure of reality, or the nature of reality, we might say, but we might say that sort of somehow the structure of the world, and what must be true of the world if our scientific beliefs and the like are correct. Somehow it's what the world must be like at a very fundamental level for these things to be true. It is metaphysics gives us the foundation for truth, and for scientific truth particularly. So it has been noted that we, in studying Western philosophy, we start with the Greek philosophers and some of the most difficult philosophers around, Plato and Aristotle. And this is a sort of an accident of history, so that beginners in philosophy have to read the two most difficult philosophers, possibly, Plato and Aristotle. This is somehow it's become inevitable, but don't worry that you find them difficult, because they are difficult. But somehow they founded the discipline that everything else was built upon. The Greeks were scientists in the modern sense as much as they are philosophers, and they started the discipline that we now call the natural sciences. Indeed, it was called physics was called natural philosophy in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period, and this was started by the philosophers before Socrates, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and engaged in then by Aristotle and onwards in the later Middle Ages, where philosophy became more interested in the nature of the physical world, and indeed modern physics came out of this type of inquiry. So this type of abstract inquiry into fundamental aspects of the world and of human life, and with questions such as, in ethics, questions such as free will: is free will real? Is free will necessary in order to have responsibility, moral responsibility? What is the role of motivation or the like in moral goodness or badness of an action? And there are inquiries into metaphysical aspects such as time and possibility, and whether we can make sense of the distinction between things being necessary and possible. The modalities, it's called. So all of these things, all together, being kind of thrown at you at once, all of these are the type of things that are involved in philosophical inquiry. So, one of the things, of course, in the old, if we think of a kind of a caricature of the ancient pagan world, and which was the world in general at the time, is when if people had questions about not just morality, but questions about the origins of the world, or the nature of the world, or the nature of anything, is to ask some wise man at the temple. And the positive thing about the wise man at the temple is he might have an answer for everything. He'll always give you an answer. The problem is there's often no reason for thinking that the answer is correct. And philosophy broke away from this type of inherited, sort of religious thinking that you got in Greece, where there were pre-established norms and pre-established answers to things, which with no real reason for thinking that they're true. So philosophy was, in some sense, kind of democratic. They started out inquiring into these things abstractly on their own, and sort of from scratch, to see what ought we to believe. If we're reasonable, if we're rational people, what should we believe? So we come to the question now: is why would theologians study philosophy? The first answer probably is that absolutely everybody should study philosophy to some extent, and one of the reasons for this is that we can learn to spot bad arguments. Probably more than ever recently, in possibly the last 80 or 90 years, it's more important than ever that people think philosophically, if not actually study philosophy. One reason for this is we can see America's recent and close call with full-blown fascist thinking, and with the kind of irrationality that comes from fascism. We can see philosophy is not just an abstract cafe sport. It has real world consequences when people are irrational. And so there's this kind of general reason that not just theologians but absolutely everyone should study philosophy. One reason for this is we can use philosophy to spot bad arguments. And all of us, in general, we can see when an argument's bad. We can see that an argument's bad, at least, and say that's a terrible argument, I shouldn't be convinced by it. what philosophy does in addition to this is it can make you find out exactly where an argument is bad and what's wrong with it. And that can stop you being shot down by bad arguments. We'll have more of these later on, but this is one kind of central thing in theology, but probably in every other discipline and in the world in general, why philosophy is important. In specifically related to theology, why might philosophy be an important thing to study? Well, we might think of questions such as people who believe that reason misleads us, and so philosophy has no place in theology. So it is possible, as this is the position of Martin Luther, that reason itself has fallen, and so reason can't be used to find out anything about the world, that it will systematically mislead us. That reason has fallen itself is a strong philosophical claim, and it needs to be defended. And if it is to be defended, it needs to be defended by reason. So it looks as though it's sort of radically self-undermining, or at least very difficult to get that type of position off the ground. And so the sort of modern notion of if we think of an example of religious belief, what's now called blind faith, which is faith that's backed up by no reasoning at all, and in fact that seems to be independent of the rational world, or independent of evidence or science or the senses or the like. That it's rather a radical position, and indeed this is a position that's compatible with the view that philosophy has no use at all to theology, and indeed reasoning has no use in theology. This needs to be defended. This is a strong view about our mental limitations, an actual radical position to take on our ability to know at all. It's not just a humility or anything like this, as people sometimes use it, say it's a kind of intellectual humility. It's not humility, it's a radical positive claim about the limitations of our knowledge. Blind faith itself as a notion probably would be a contradiction in terms to most of the philosophers we'll be discussing now. Faith was viewed as a rational position, and blind faith, belief in something without any reason to believe it's true, would be seen as irrational, and therefore not something we want to be stuck with. It is a strange position if someone says, "Why do you believe this?" and they say, "Oh, no reason at all." And again, some examples from America are kind of illuminating as to how dangerous the world can get when you don't have any basis in reasoning itself. One of them is that Ted Cruz, the Texan senator, said that 39% of the people in America believe that the election was fraudulent, and this is their reality. Yes. Well, on the face of it, people don't get to have private realities. This is their belief, and their belief is demonstrably false. So saying this is their reality is not just kind of inaccurate, it's tending towards dangerous when people have this type of kind of strongly irrational view. Likewise, when somebody says it's true for me, either they can mean it's true, which means that it's a fact about the world, or that they believe it. Usually, true for me simply means I believe it, and this type of loose language again is something that philosophical training will get rid of. You no longer have this type of sort of flimsy language, or let people get away with it indeed. So the philosophy's use is very much in making precise claims, precise statements, avoiding ambiguity and the like. It's much what it's a way of getting clear writing. That's why it's incidentally why I'll be using Bertrand Russell's writing, not because he's better than any other philosopher. It's because he's very, very clear. He's never never vague, never too wordy, and is to the point, and though occasionally difficult, not unclear. So it is good to see when we're looking at arguments, not just that an argument is bad again, which most of us will just pick up, but what is it that makes the argument bad? What about the argument that someone is making? An argument here is not a fight, of course. It's a technical term for an argued position, effectively a logical or rational argument. So newspapers and politicians are very often the best place to go when we want to look at a bad argument. And so I'll give you a few examples of this. Prior to the past 4 years, I used to go directly to Tony Blair as probably one of the best examples of presenting sort of systematically poor arguments that were nevertheless accepted. When I was in London, Tony Blair effectively had the following argument in favour of getting rid of closing times in pubs. Again, independently of why there might be good reasons of getting rid of closing times, this is an example of a bad argument. So Blair said, England has a violent drinking culture and it has closing times. Continental Europe doesn't have a violent drinking culture and doesn't have closing times. So, what are we to conclude? Blair concluded, if we get rid of closing times, we'll get rid of a violent drinking culture. So, you can see there, the structure is wrong. The structure of the argument is wrong, because the truths at the beginning, you have two truth statements, and the conclusion doesn't follow. That means that the argument is invalid. So that's one type of poor argument. The other one that of course Blair did a great deal of damage with is the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, where he demanded a negative proof. Okay, not a logically bad argument, but it's simply something that's impossible. If someone demands that you give proof that there are no space pixies on the moon, of course there's no way of proving that there aren't any. But there's no reason to sort of sit on the fence and saying that there aren't any. You can't prove a negative of this kind. And Blair asked for proof that there is no that there are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. No such proof can be given. And that was the that was the reason for going to war. He demanded an impossible proof. In fact, they passed a law in Britain when I was there that said if you have any encrypted information, anything that's encoded on a computer, that you have to surrender the key to the government to let them decrypt it, or prove that it's not encrypted. The problem is, it's not possible to prove that any piece of information, take the handout. If the government in England at the moment were to ask me, give me the key that decrypts this information, I can say it's not encrypted, it's just a text. And they say, prove it's not encrypted. You can see pretty clearly that they're asking me to prove something that's impossible. If you have a digital photograph, on your computer it's stored as ones and zeros. You could write a code into that will decrypt. But if someone demands that one of your digital photographs, that prove to me it's not encrypted, we can see this is a bad argument. You're demanding something impossible and actually putting the burden of proof on the defence rather than the prosecution. Surprisingly enough, this went under the radar, and that is a law in Britain now, demanding impossible proof. Of course, in America, superseding Blair's bad arguments, the entire nature of reality itself has been called into question, where people are talking about there being alternative facts. Again, against the orthodoxa, the common views, Trump said, you can't believe the things you hear and see. It goes on. We could spend the rest of the lecture course looking at bad arguments that came from America recently. But the sort of belief versus reality is one of the important things, and one of the news channels in America was interviewing someone who insisted that Trump won the election by a massive amount, and they said there's no evidence, and he said, these are the things that I choose to believe. Again, we can see that there's something highly problematic with thinking that beliefs are things that we can just simply switch on and off at our will. We should believe things that we've got some reason for thinking that they're true. This is the idea that we can simply defend our beliefs by saying, I choose to believe this. It's problematic, to say the very least. Right, we'll go on to the second quotation. This is from Etienne Gilson, the great French scholar of Thomas Aquinas. One of the finest and most prolific writers, along with Jacques Maritain in the early and mid 20th century. So this is about the history of philosophy. The history of philosophy is much more a part of philosophy itself than the history of science is part of science. For it is not impossible to become a competent scientist without knowing much about the history of science. But no man can carry very far his own philosophical reflections unless he first studies the history of philosophy. And this is something that's definitely true. The one major counterexample to this is Ludwig Wittgenstein, who dismissed the history of philosophy pretty much out of hand. He didn't think there were. We'll get onto this in the first study day. Actually, I'll have a few quotations from him about kind of the nature of philosophy. But he didn't believe that there were real philosophical problems. He simply thought that there were confusions we're making in language, and that's why we think there are philosophical problems. Wittgenstein was both very dismissive of the history of philosophy and completely ignorant of it as well. He thought Plato and Aristotle were pointless, but also he didn't study them. He thought it sort of pointless. So we can see in looking at philosophy that it is similar in some ways to science, and we're trying to use reason to and based upon the evidence at our hands, we use pure reason to reach some conclusions about the nature of reality. One thing that's distinctive about philosophy, what distinguishes it from the sciences, is that it's not quite clear what progress in philosophy might mean. Again, we'll get into this in a little more detail in the study day. But it's clearly not like progress in the sciences, where we can stack facts upon facts and get more and more detailed theories. And of course, there is the caricature of the cafe philosopher who's sort of idly, smoking a pipe and drinking coffee and thinking about the nature of the world, might have relatively little effect. So there's no doubt that in science you get positive progress. You have Galileo established that the Earth rotates around the Sun. After that, Kepler, based upon detailed calculations, measurements indeed of the position of Venus and Mars, established that the planets move in an ellipse around the Sun. So you have all of these things that are, we just increase our knowledge, and now you have, no one seriously doubts that the Earth is in motion around the Sun. No one doubts global warming seriously, evolution, genetics, all of these things. That diseases are caused by microbes and bacteria and viruses, and we now we know why earthquakes are caused. They're not kind of supernatural punishments. They're shifting tectonic plates. All of these things are kind of clear progress in science. But there's very little. There's a great deal of consensus in physics and chemistry and biology, and very, very little consensus in philosophy. This leads some people to think, Wittgenstein possibly among them, that philosophy is bunk and it's simply people, saying interesting things or possibly not interesting things, and it never really reaches to reality at all. So one of the reasons for this is that in philosophy the radical disagreements really are very often right at the fundamental level. They're in physics you have a set of axioms that every physicist every physicist accepts, such as laws of nature exist. These are kind of necessary regularities that persist and always occur. All the physicists believe that we've got some sort of access, epistemic access is called in philosophy. Episteme is knowledge. We'll see it in the text. Epistemic access means that we are able to know it. I've got access to the laws of nature or the regularities in nature. And physicists also believe that there are structures independent of our thinking, independent of my beliefs, that I can find out about. All of the physicists hold these things to be axioms, to be fundamental kind of beliefs at the start of their inquiry. In philosophy, there are plenty of philosophers who disagree that there are fixed laws of nature, that the world is independent of our thought. There are realist philosophers like the ones we'll be studying, and myself indeed, that believe that we detect structures in the world, that we know the world because somehow the world impinges upon us, impinges upon our senses, and we know the world in this kind of direction. The world has an impact upon us, and we come to know it in that way. There are plenty of philosophers who believe that we humans, our minds, structure the world into the structures we see. Somehow, humans create all of the structures that we apparently detect. So, when all of these things are in doubt at the very fundamental level, it's no wonder that philosophy doesn't have any real consensus in any way, because precisely all of these axioms, if you like, of inquiry are up for grabs. So we can ask, why would people doubt these things? This is something that we won't get into probably even in this year's course. We'll have it in next year's. But so the axioms of philosophy are these types of kind of fundamental beliefs that are up for grabs themselves. So that's how general the philosophical inquiry is. It goes right back to the foundations. So what kind of inquiry is philosophy in that sense? So F.H. Bradley, the English philosopher from the early 20th century, an Oxford philosopher, Bradley said he was describing what metaphysics is, and he gave the following definition. Metaphysics is the finding of bad arguments to believe what we already believe, or bad reasons, the finding of bad reasons to believe what we already believe. So, clearly being a little frivolous here. But we could say, rather more kindly, that philosophy is finding good reasons for believing what we already believe. And of course, again, there are some things that we might believe that when we inquire into them, we'll realise we shouldn't have believed them at all. But we have the starting point of trying to defend our kind of common beliefs. So some of these questions in metaphysics and in philosophy in general are ones that are only really discussed in philosophical inquiry itself. They're only really discussed in detail in philosophy. So if we ask a question such as, am I the same person I was when I was 5 years old? On the face of it, most of us accept that we're the same person we were when we were 5. But if you asked someone who believes that they were, why? What makes you the same person? What makes it true that you're the same person you were when you were 5 years old? The chances are they'll give you some bad arguments and some poor reasons for believing it's true. We might say, is it the same matter? Well, no, it's different matter. Matter for bodies changes over time. Is it my memories that makes it the same? Of course, my memories can be unreliable, and my memories change over time. I don't have the same memories now that I had when I was 5. So, indeed, I could miss, months of memories just by forgetfulness, and yet it doesn't stop it being the same person. And we can go on and maybe say it's my DNA that makes me the same. Well, no, you might have had a twin who's got actually identical DNA to you, and so on and so on. So, something that all of us sort of accept, I'm the same person I was when I was 5, turns out it's very difficult to figure out what makes that true. This is what philosophy does, tries to find reasons. We can say some philosophers ask the question, are books, are they one thing? Is this book a single object? Well, of course it is. It's one thing. It's also, lots of pages all stuck together. But what makes it a thing? What makes it the same thing? Outside the philosophy room, no one would ever, ask questions as seemingly as kind of frivolous or foolish as, is this the same book you gave me last week? There seems to be a straightforward answer to it. You say, well, there's your signature on it. That's your book. But what makes it the same? Is it the same matter? Well, no. If you can smell a book, that means that there are particles coming off it. If you write on it, you add extra matter, and you scrape off pieces of the paper on your pen. It's not the same matter. It's not the structure of the book either, because you can have lots of copies of it. There seems to be a continuity going on, but it's hard to say that it's exactly the same object. Likewise, outside philosophy, no one would say, is that the same shirt you were wearing last week? And they go, oh, it's a tough one. I don't know. Well, these things aren't sort of generally difficult to answer in real life. What makes them true? What makes it true that's the same object? We can either say, some people like to say it's subjective. Again, that can't be right. It can't be right that for me it's the same book and for you that it's not. We're now retreating back to the realm of beliefs. There must be a truth to the matter whether it's the same book or not. Because of the difficulty in finding out something as apparently simple as what makes it the same object over time, or what makes a book one object, a unitary one object. Plenty of analytic philosophers have said it is difficult to give conditions as to what makes it the same object over time, or what makes a book one thing rather than several things. Therefore, books don't exist in principle. Shirts don't exist. We can see this is perhaps what might give some philosophy rather a bad name for being just a little extreme, and saying it might be difficult to find out what is the case in these metaphysical questions, but that's no reason to think that there are no books, or to say that books are just a general way we use words we use that we can for convenience, but there are no books. Again, that's something. It being difficult to give an account of something doesn't mean that we should abandon our belief that books exist in the most extreme kind of cases. Though, common enough, I know quite a few philosophers who don't believe that books really exist. And we'll see when we get into reading philosophy, some of this stuff is a little bit kind of tough going, and you need to be kind of patient in reading the philosophy and in figuring out what's being said, rather than dismissing, out of hand something that looks odd. Plato in particular is a philosopher who is difficult to read, and when you read Plato, you need to be charitable, and indeed this is one of the terms they use in reading philosophy, is the principle of charity. That's important. So the principle of charity is, when you're reading a philosopher, it's not that you instantly just try to believe that everything they've said is true or that their arguments are good, but don't immediately jump to the position that paints their arguments in the worst light. We can sort of try to figure out on their own ground what they're saying, and be patient and go where their argument takes you. And then you can, of course, criticise it or agree with it where you like. But being charitable rather than instantly saying this is an absurd position, and going from that kind of perspective, it's better to apply this principle of charity to philosophers, particularly philosophers like Plato and the ancient philosophers, because their views are very strange to us. They're very different, but they're worth sort of taking seriously in order to not just in order to sharpen up our minds in studying philosophy in this way, but in order to understand really what they're saying. So this is one of the things that we'll find in talking about Russell's kind of realistic picture of philosophy, is that we do tend to, when in defending something like that I'm the same person when I was 5, typically we'll start out by giving arguments that really aren't very convincing, simply because we haven't kind of gone through the middle of philosophy and seeing what is a good argument. We try to give a real rational foundation, but that's why philosophy is a kind of an independent discipline. It's to sharpen up our kind of mental faculties and do a direct kind of analysis of these kinds of questions to try and give us more convincing kind of rational foundations to the things that we believe. And we might, one of the things that's apparent in studying philosophy is we might realise that a lot of the justifications that we have or that we give for particular beliefs might be much flimsier than we had thought hitherto. And of course Russell said this kind of function of philosophy will diminish our sort of dogmatism when we realise that we're pretty certain that something's correct, but we're not quite certain why or what makes it the case. And it reduces this type of intellectual dogmatism. And of course the types of things that are questioned in philosophy as well are very broad and sometimes very radical. Danny Otten, who was a lecturer in Maynooth when I was there, he's a very interesting philosopher, and he said that really if the state knew what philosophers were up to and what they were questioning, they may not be so happy to fund them, in that philosophers ask such questions as, should we obey the judges? What reason is there for me to obey the judgment of a judge if the judge judged something incorrectly or unjustly? And it turns out there's relatively little in way of clear arguments why we should, because it seems that we shouldn't accept injustice because injustice is bad. The arguments aren't that difficult in some way, but they're radical to the extent that it might make us not do what, as they say, what everyone believes. Everyone knows you should obey judges. Well, perhaps we should question that. And then there are other types of arguments that you get. Immanuel Kant had one about how to find out if something's immoral, and you find this quite a bit in kind of general moral discourse of any act. If everyone did this, then the world would be a disaster. And we're sort of taught to think that that's a good argument because that's the argument that we're always given. It turns out it's a fairly flimsy argument. If everyone did this, then it would be bad. If you have the nuclear codes and someone demands that you tell them where the nuclear codes are and you lie, that seems to be a good thing. But if someone says, if everyone lied all the time, the world would be in chaos. So what? That's got nothing to do with me lying to stop someone getting the nuclear codes. That's changing the subject. That's Bertrand Russell's example was interesting because Russell was a sort of a thorn in the side of the English establishment. He was a conscientious objector in the First World War. He lost his fellowship in Cambridge and got jailed for it. He founded CND later in the 60s, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. He sort of notoriously at the time he was an atheist, which didn't sit well with a lot of the establishment. And he was being given an award by the then king, and the king couldn't help himself but to have a gripe at Russell's anti-establishment behaviour. And he said, if everyone behaved like you, then the world would be in chaos. If everyone stood up against the state. And Russell came up with a counter-example, and this is the thing we'll be dealing with, a counter-example. So Russell said, if everyone walked down every street they walked down and rang every doorbell, then it would be a constant chaos. But if the postman rings every doorbell in every street he walks down, there's no problem at all. So the argument from universalization in ethics isn't a good one, or at least it isn't one that always holds. It's not one that always holds. So in philosophy, we ask what is open to question. The answer really is everything, though not all at once, obviously, or at least not always all at once. It won't stop us acting normally, as David Hume said. All of the abstract thoughts about whether the external world is real or whether there are other minds or not. And he said all of these disappear when I'm off, as Hume said, off drinking brandy and playing billiards, which is obviously what philosophers in the 18th century did. But all of these things are brought into question, and it really, philosophy tries to analyse the intellectual foundation for our ordinary thinking. That said, the question is what should we accept in argumentation? What should we be happy with in our ability to defend our beliefs? One thing that's very difficult, this is just a really kind of strong example of what it's very difficult to give a good argument for, is why are there other minds? So I know I have a mind because I can look at it from within, and I believe that everyone else has a mind. I suppose there's some evolutionary reason to think that it's obvious that other people have minds. They're like me and they behave like me. But what strong reason is there, if you're a skeptic who stops believing there are other minds, what reason is there to say that there aren't, or there are other minds? Difficult to convince someone. So a solipsist, that's a term. A solipsist is someone who believes that he or she is the only mind in the universe. Everything else is either an illusion, or that people are kind of automata or robots, or that they're the only mind, and simply because they've only reason to believe in their own mind and not other people's minds. So what do you do if a solipsist puts it to you that you've no reason to believe that there are other minds? Do you need to convince the solipsist of your view that there are other minds? Not remotely. He might be difficult to convince. You have to convince yourself that there's no reason to accept the solipsistic position, the position that there are no other minds. So this is kind of an extreme skeptical position. Though Bertrand Russell, indeed, again, he apparently met someone who claimed to be a solipsist, and then absurdly said, I'm a solipsist, and I can't understand why more people aren't as well. So, which is nicely undermining. So this is about the burden of proof. It's not that we need to convince our opponent if we're debating, say, or even a virtual opponent if we're just going through a kind of an argumentation in our heads. We don't need to convince our opponents that of our views, and we don't need to defeat our opponents in debate. We need to establish to ourselves that our opponent or the other position's views have no strong bearing on us as an argument. And so this comes on to another thing in the philosophy, and that is a kind of another definition. Again, we saw Bradley's definition that philosophy tries to come up with and it was the bad reasons for believing what we already believe. Wilfrid Sellars, it was an American philosopher who kind of thrived in the mid-20th century, and Sellars described metaphysics like this. He said, metaphysics is a study of how the world, in the most general sense of that term, hangs together. In the most general sense of that term. So this is a really, you have a starting point that's kind of sort of obvious, and then showing the, really asking what something is like. So first of all, you ask the question: is something real? Are there anythings? Say, are there humans? What are humans like? Is there matter? What is matter is like? So of anything, what is it? Is there of any x? Is there an x? And if there is an x, what is x like? Does it exist? And if it does, what is it like? And of course, we're not talking about generally. Well, obviously, books. As I said, some philosophers deny that there are books. Some philosophers deny that there are persons. But, persons is a good example of something that's difficult. We're saying trying to establish what a person is. If we can say what a person persisting through time is, we want to find out what a person is. This is not an easy question. Things like ethical values. We believe that ethical values exist. There are, some things are wrong. Some things are right. Some states of affairs in the world are unjust. Some states of affairs are just. What is an ethical value? Again, it's like one of these things, I know it when I see it, but what exactly is it? What are ethical values? Do they exist in the mind? Are they part of the external world? Obviously, they don't appear to be physical things. Are they arbitrary or invented? Are they illusions? Or are they, Thomas Aquinas' position, based upon the Greek view, is that ethical values are indeed part of the nature of human beings. This is the theory of the natural law, that is somehow ethical value is written into the structure of, written very, very figuratively, but it is part of the structure of human beings. Or as Duns Scotus said, and William of Ockham as well, if could ethical values have been different? Could it have been right to do something? Could the world have been in such a way that it's right to, I think William of Ockham's example was that it's right to kill your parents. Ockham said, possibly, but only with different human beings. You'd need to change the nature of the human people. Their natures would need to be different for the ethics to be different. So it's written, somehow, it's embossed in the structure of human nature. So we can see now in this kind of, even discussing whether values are real, this is now, we're into the kind of difficult areas in philosophy. We're doing real philosophy, or this is what philosophy does as a rule. So here's another example. It's from John Duns Scotus. He's not the Scotus of the old Irish £5 note, who is Scotus Eriugena. He was a 9th century brilliant Neoplatonist who taught in Paris. But John Duns Scotus from Duns in Berwickshire died in 1349. He's the philosopher I've spent most of my sort of philosophical life studying. And he had an interesting question, a little puzzle about distinction, and it leads us to a metaphysical question. So I've drawn 4 objects. As you can see, these perfectly rendered objects here. This is 3 trees and a bus. So the question is, which is the odd one out? So, it not being a trick question, the bus is the odd one out. And why is that the case? So, again, this is a children's game, the Sesame Street thing. One of these things is not like the other. Which is the odd one out? Well, It turns out it's fairly obvious. This is the odd one out. But why? That's the question. Are they all equally distinct? Well, they are. There are four objects. They're all equally distinct. There are all of them are numerically distinct. And yet, in one way of thinking, they're all equally distinct. But another way of thinking, we can say one of them is more distinct. The bus is more distinct because we can tell it apart from the others. We can tell it's the odd one out of the set. And John Duns Scotus had the following principle, which is a kind of a sensible principle in his metaphysics. For if there are degrees of distinction, which this sort of shows, if there are degrees of distinction, this implies degrees of unity. And that means that these things have some type of unity. Not numerical unity, otherwise there'd be one thing. They have a different type of unity. They have a unity of structure. They have the same structure, that's what makes them trees. And that this one lacks. And this is what Plato, we'll get on to Plato, this is what Plato was talking about when he discussed forms. Aristotle also called them forms. In the Middle Ages they tended to be called essences or natures. And we might think of natures or essences as structures. The trees share a structure that is lacked by the bus. That's what makes the bus the odd one out. And this sharing the structure here is actually the heavy problem, the problem of universals as it's called. Universals are general terms like tree, bus, human. They're the structures that belong to individuals like Socrates, this tree and that tree. So something in the world makes it true. It's not just my belief. Some people will say, "Oh, I can see it's different." That's not good enough. Your seeing or believing that something's different doesn't make it true. If I'd said the odd one out was this tree, I'd be wrong. So we can, being able to see the odd one out is not a good answer. It's what makes it wrong. Something must make it wrong that this is not the odd one out. And what is that? So we can sort of see here that this is why Aristotle said that science is not the object. The science is not of individuals but of natures. So when we do science, we don't study Tim and John and Mary. We study human nature. We study the structures that make up human beings, the distinct human beings. Vets aren't experts in Dobbin and red rum. They're experts in horses, in horse nature. If you imagine a world that just had individuals in it, we can just call them A, B, C, without this type of extra deep structure, science is clearly an impossibility, because science is of common features of things, not of the individuals themselves. Again, we've got into pretty dense and heavy metaphysics. So there's a chap. He was actually an English philosopher from the sort of early Middle Ages, 9th century, I guess. English philosopher called Fridigius of Tours. He worked at Tours in France, though he was that's how to spell it there. But Fridigius of Tours was a student of Alcuin, and who was again a philosopher from Northumberland, and he wrote Fridigius was an abbot, and he wrote a letter, I think a letter to the Pope on the existence of nothingness and darkness, and again a classic sort of philosophy at its excessive worst, you might think. But it's a very interesting text as to why, when we use sentences with nothing as a part of the sentence, or darkness, what are we talking about? It looks as though they're non-existent. Darkness isn't real, nothingness isn't real. And he took a position, he was sort of a grammarian as much as a philosopher, and he took the position that he's at the School of Chartres, but his view was that because there are true sentences, according to him, true sentences with nothing or nothingness in the sentence, or darkness, then these things, counter to how we normally think, have to be real things. So nothing is a kind of some type of thing, and darkness is a type of thing. And so one of the examples we could use is from the he was trying to explain the kind of scripture that God made the world from nothing. You think, well, for that to be true, you need to have God as a noun, nothing as a noun, and for that sentence to be true, both the nouns have to exist. Clearly now we can see something's gone wrong. But what? So this is what in philosophy now they call logical form. It became a big thing in the later Middle Ages. William of Ockham was an expert in getting the logical form of a sentence right, that it doesn't mislead you about what's real in the world. So the correct form of that sentence, on if we're opposing Fridigis's view, rather than saying God particle made the world from nothing, nothing as a thing, we can have the logical, the proper logical form of the sentence will not involve saying that nothingness is real. So we'll have the proper logical form of the sentence is this: God made the world not from something, not from something else. That's the correct logical form. Now I have no commitment, as they say, no commitment to believing that nothingness is a thing. So we can see here this is a kind of a minor type of progress that we're making in philosophy here. There's definitely some type of move forward. We've got the logical form, so we can show we're not committed to these things. So we can see here. I mean, one of the things we'll see when we're looking at the function of philosophy and theology is philosophy was often called the handmaid of theology, in that it's used primarily as a logical entity to get our logic right, to make sure our arguments are valid, that the conclusions follow validly from the premises, to avoid ambiguity, to avoid vagueness, which is can be as bad as ambiguity. We can see in validity that Blair's argument about the pubs, it isn't a valid argument. The conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, even if the conclusions are false, despite the premises being true. So you can see here in logic, the important thing about logic is that logical arguments are based upon the structure of the argument. A good argument has a particular type of structures. Bad arguments lack this structure. And logic, as I said, infallibly guarantees a move from some truths to other truths. That's all logic does. It does very little in a way. Very often logic is used vaguely in kind of popular culture and writing in general to mean something like reasoning. Mr. Spock, of course, in Star Trek, says Captain Logic dictates. Logic dictates nothing of the sort. It simply moves you rationally, infallibly, from one set of truths to other truths. So, and again, reasoning here is really what Mr. Spock was talking about, and reasoning, again, as even as St. Augustine said, reasoning can occasionally fail us, but it's a very poor reason to jettison reason itself, because it's all we have, really. So this we can see this course is really purely in a philosophical kind of inquiry, and it's not really just for philosophy as for theologians either. But you can find in discussing some things that are in theology, we discuss not whether they can be proved or not, but whether they're logically consistent, whether or not, independently of whether they're true. So questions like the Trinity and the like, these are sort of claims that can be then defended at least as logically coherent. And this is kind of, again, philosophy as the handmaid of theology. So, in the next quotation I have here is from from Bertrand Russell. It's quite a long one, but I'll read it out. And it's called The Value of Philosophy. Russell believed that philosophy was kind of valuable of itself, and he thought that it could undo the kind of tyranny of custom, as he called it. The value of philosophy is, in fact, to be sought largely in its very uncertainty. The man who has no tincture of philosophy goes through life imprisoned in the prejudices derived from common sense, from the habitual habits of his age or his nation, from the convictions which have grown up in his mind, without the cooperation or consent of his deliberate reason. To such a man the world tends to become definite, finite, obvious. Common objects rouse no questions, and familiar possibilities are contemptuously rejected. As soon as we begin to philosophize, on the contrary, we find, as we saw in the opening chapters again of this book, that even the most everyday things can lead to problems to which only very incomplete answers can be given. Philosophy, though unable to tell us what with certainty what the true answer of the doubts which is raised, is able to suggest many possibilities which enlarge our thoughts and free us from the tyranny of custom. Thus, while diminishing our feelings of certainty as to what things are, will greatly increase our knowledge as to what they might be. It removes the somewhat arrogant dogmatism of those who have never travelled into the region of liberating doubt, and it keeps alive our sense of wonder by showing familiar things in an unfamiliar aspect. So you can see here, the tyranny of custom here, of course, is such things as people saying, well, slavery is justified because there have always been slaves. There's always been slavery. This, incidentally, this isn't far from the position that Thomas Aquinas said. He said slavery is not part of the natural law, but it's part of the kind of the law of this world. It's just the way things are, and he didn't condemn it. John Duns Scotus, a generation later, said slavery is indeed in every country we know of. It's been in every country we've ever known of, and it might even be the case that everybody believed that slavery is right. Well, everybody's wrong. It's possible for everyone to be wrong. It's possible for the entire consensus to be wrong. And he said, simply because slavery offends against human beings' natural quest or natural kind of feeling for liberty, the natural thirst for liberty, therefore everyone could be wrong. So this shows kind of subjectivism is one of the things that Russell is opposed here. That sometimes people disagree without any fault. If you like apples and I dislike apples, it's not as if we're really disagreeing. But when it comes to something like genocide, it isn't the case that you can say you think genocide bad and I can say, well, I think it's good, it's good for me. If that's the case, then we're just talking about the contents of our own minds and we're not discussing the world at all. Actually, what's happening is we're discussing the values themselves in the world, and we're saying something about the world when we say genocide is bad. We say, and likewise when you get arguments from politicians particularly, who will quickly, sneakily change the subject. So if as people have against talking to Tory politicians in Britain and in Ireland, people have said it is unjust to brutalise or sort of excessively target the most vulnerable members of our society while exempting the rich. And the reply is, I understand that you feel strongly. What's happened there is they've changed the subject. The subject now is no longer a state of affairs in the world that's unjust. The subject is now my mental thoughts. And of course the remedy to that is switch off the television or take a pill or something. They're now no longer discussing ethical values in the world. And if we, through philosophy, we can see that this type of fairly egregious reasoning that's meant to shut you down, if you, through the study of philosophy, you can prevent yourself being shut down by these dodgy arguments. So, in this instance, we're actually having a disagreement about something in the world independently about what I happen to believe. There is right and wrong, and these types of arguments are they're shifting the subject from an ethical claim, a claim about the injustice of a state of affairs in the world, to a claim about my psychology, again, which can be fixed with a pill. Because we're not, again, when I say something is unjust, I'm not talking about my feelings. You know, my feelings are a byproduct of my being a moral person. They're not the subject of the inquiry. So, I'll continue this quotation on the next page. The mind that has become accustomed to the freedom and impartiality of philosophic contemplation will preserve something of the same freedom and impartiality in the world of action and emotion. It will view its purposes and desires as parts of a whole, with the absence of insistence that results from seeing them as infinitesimal fragments of the world, of which all the rest is unaffected by any one man's deeds. The impartiality, which in contemplation is the unalloyed desire for truth, is the very same quality in mind which in action is justice, and in motion is the universal love, which can be given to all, and not only to those who are judged useful or admirable. Thus, contemplation enlarges not only the objects of our thoughts, but also the objects of our actions and our affections. It makes us citizens of the universe, not only of one walled city at war with the rest of us, with all the rest. In this citizenship of the universe consists man's true freedom and his liberation from the thraldom of narrow hopes and fears. You can see that Russell's, this was kind of Russell's Platonic period where he had fairly high hopes for philosophy and held it in high esteem. There are a few of us who hold philosophy as sort of an idealistic way now. And most of the philosophers that will be studying on this course do, actually. That's one of the things about Russell's writing, is he is clear, but also sometimes what he says isn't particularly complicated, but it is well said. And he, of course, in the campaign for nuclear disarmament, the BBC found he was taking a very unpopular position, saying that nuclear weapons should be got rid of. And when they interviewed Russell and his wife when he was in his 90s outside the War Office, where he got arrested, they said, "Why are you hanging out with all these hippies and, you know, being against these perfectly wonderful nuclear weapons?" And Russell said, "Well, I come to believe that many of the governments in the world today are engaged in a policy that may well result in the extinction of mankind, and some of us think that might be rather a pity." Again, not a particularly complicated point, but beautifully put. So, I'll read the last little quote here. "Philosophy is to be studied not for the sake of any definite answers to the questions, since no definite answers can, as a rule, be known to be true, but rather for the sake of the questions themselves, because these questions enlarge our conception of what is possible, enrich our intellectual imagination, and diminish the dogmatic assurance that closes the mind against speculation. Above all, because through the greatness of the universe, which philosophy contemplates, the mind is also rendered great and becomes capable of that union with the universe which constitutes its highest good." And then I end there with a little cartoon from the Evening Standard after Russell was arrested, looking very bright among the other prisoners. So, I will say, when you're reading philosophy, I'm going to put some notes up on the forum. Do keep an eye on the forum. When you're reading philosophy, do read slowly. If you're used to reading novels or even history or the like, philosophy is sometimes slow going. And the advice is very often to reread what you've just read. That is good advice sometimes. Often the best advice is to read on to the end of the section. Often your questions will be answered later on, but it may be slow going. Karl Popper, the great Austrian philosopher in the 1960s, when the London School of Economics wanted to bring in speed reading classes. Again, speed reading it's not a thing. People don't retain anything for any length of time. Popper said that he'd only allow the speed reading classes if there were slow reading classes for philosophers. He believed that you need to read things quite slowly, and sometimes philosophy is dense, but the course is manageable. The other thing to remember, it's very important when you're reading philosophy, most important when you look at something like pre-Socratic philosophy or the early Greek stuff, there's a tendency when we read philosophers who have unfamiliar or strange views, there's a tendency just to think about the things that they thought. Plato reckoned this philosopher believed this. Somehow we create lists of things that they thought. This will serve you badly unless you constantly remember that every philosophical theory is an answer to the question. There's some question being asked, and this theory is a solution to the question. So this is why it's important when you're reading everything, particularly the pre-Socratics, I'd say, and Plato and Aristotle, always keep in mind, what is this theory? What are these arguments meant to explain? What question's being asked? This is the answer to some question. Always keep the question in mind, and you will do well. Good. Before I head off and warm myself up, there will be a tutorial directly after this where we'll have some questions and answers. The other thing is, if you want a book for the course, I'm going to put some stuff up online, of course, and notes and the like. If you want a single book that will help you out, Anthony Kenny's A New History of Western Philosophy. It's all in one volume now, and you can get it from bookdepository.com or the like. That book is excellent, and it'll even help you for the next year in modern philosophy and early modern. So, that's all I shall say, and I shall meet you afterwards for the tutorial. Thank you.